Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. Following the discussions at the Munich Security Conference, European leaders are gathered in Paris for an emergency summit with Ukraine's future hanging in the balance. At Munich, high-level talks underscore the growing tensions between the United States, Europe and Ukraine. The US announced plans to hold direct talks with Russia on ending the war, sidelining both European nations and Ukraine. This has sparked concerns in Europe about its diminishing role in the peace process. Leaders in Paris today are working to ensure Europe's involvement in shaping any potential peace deal, with key topics like security guarantees for Ukraine, European military support, and the creation of a European defense force up for discussion. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has made it clear no peace deal will be accepted without his country's direct involvement. As these two major meetings unfold, we will break down what's at stake for Europe and the world, and whether this is a turning point in Europe's geopolitical influence. Joining me now from Norway is Glenn Diesen, professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. And from Kyiv with us, we have Lena Urmey from Dignitas organization. Dear experts, warm welcome to our program.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Diesen, let me start with you. With the US now holding direct talks with Russia to end the war in Ukraine, sidelining Europe and Ukraine, what do you think this means for Europe's geopolitical influence? Is Europe at risk of losing its voice in shaping the future of the conflict?
Yeah, no, I think Europe has already lost much of its voice. It's also lost much of its relevance. But it's been like this for many years. That is, NATO is effectively the United States, and the Europeans follow. What has changed is that the United States doesn't necessarily consider its security and its interests to align with that of Europe. Because at the same time as Europe has lost a lot of its relevance and become excessively dependent on the US, we also see that the European position, especially on issues such as Ukraine, it's seen as different, being too different from that of the United States. That is, the Europeans, they have very unrealistic demands for the war in Ukraine. They're seen as directly undermining diplomacy. Indeed, they sabotaged or boycotted diplomacy for 3 years. They refused to even sit down with Russia and talk. They said they seem to be willing to or interested in undermining any peace negotiations. So given that they have such a difficult or unproductive role, it's easier for the United States simply to ignore them. And I think the Americans have been very clear. They don't really have a role. But this isn't something new. This is the Europeans have had a declining role and influence for many years now. This is what happens when you have excessive dependence on one state. And this is especially problematic in a multipolar system where you say the rest of the world are diversifying their ties, linking themselves with all the major powers, while the Europeans have severed themselves from the Russians, Chinese, and subordinated themselves more and more to the United States. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Europe doesn't really have that much to contribute with anymore, and they don't really have to be invited to even join the negotiations.
Well, President Zelensky has made it clear that Ukraine will not accept a peace deal without its direct involvement. Given the exclusion of Ukraine from the US-Russia talks, how does Ukraine plan to assert its position in these negotiations, and what can Europe do to support this?
I'm not sure how Ukraine would be planning to assert that. That would depend on the proposal and the plan of the president of Ukraine. But I think excluding Ukraine from the negotiation is not a wise move, because no one knows the enemy as much as Ukraine does. Ukraine de facto turned to be a treasure trove of the knowledge of Russia, its battle strategies, its equipment, its approaches, and to exclude such a valuable partner, not seeing the benefit of including such a knowledgeable partner in the negotiations, I think will backfire. And we're risking to see President Trump coming back to the table with the peace deal for Ukraine and having Ukraine to reject that because it will not be something that Ukrainian people will agree to. I think Ukraine definitely needs to be part of such negotiations. Thank you.
Glenn, the Munich Security Conference highlighted growing tensions between the US and Europe. Do you believe that these tensions will ultimately lead to a shift in the traditional transatlantic alliances, or is it just a temporary rift in an otherwise strong relationship?
No, I think the United States are planning to pivot. They want to pivot away from Europe and towards Asia. This didn't start with Trump. It didn't start with Biden. It was Obama under his administration that he indicated this goal. But if you want to pivot to a place, you have to pivot away from a place, and that place is Europe. And in order to get out of Europe, you also have to get out of Ukraine, which is why it's interesting that the US made it clear that in any peace negotiation, NATO expansionism has to be taken off the table, because this is, again, why the war started. This is why the Russians invaded. So this has to be part of any peace settlement. They also recognized there would have to be recognition that Ukraine wouldn't get all its territories back. And also the Americans said that they were not interested to be part of any security guarantees. Now they walked some of this back a bit, perhaps not to give everything away at the beginning, but what's very important is also the argument which they made that Europe will not be a strategic priority anymore for the United States. This is because the world is becoming multipolar. In a multipolar world, it's not in the interest of the United States to push all the other great powers to get together so they will collectively balance the US. Instead, America should try to accommodate Russia and improve relations, and it wants to pivot to China in order to balance it, as China is seen as the main adversary. Now, this is, a lot of this is based on their realistic calculations. Indeed, what the Americans have agreed to largely already is what has to be agreed to. That is, there will not be a NATO expansion to Ukraine. This simply won't be acceptable. And also the territories won't return. This can't be achieved. NATO's run out of weapons. The Ukrainians run out of manpower. We're moving towards nuclear war. And we're pushing Russia towards China. This is not in the strategic interest of the United States. Unfortunately for Europe, they're no longer in the strategic interest of the United States either, which is why the US will be seeking to leave Ukraine in order to begin to pack up and reduce its presence in Europe as well.
Elena, at this Paris summit today, the key topics like security guarantees and the creation of a European defense force are being discussed. What do you see as the most critical element for Ukraine in ensuring its security and sovereignty, especially if Europe takes a more active role in defense?
I think presence of the troops which would mitigate and observe the upholding of the peace agreement or ceasefire agreement, and creation of the buffer zone that would guarantee non-invasion for the term of the agreement would be the important parts to see in such guarantees, as well as increased sanctions and monitoring of activity of Russia, and probably demands to lessen the army and capabilities of Russia, and more strict control over its economic activities and sanctions.
Lena, one additional question to you. Recently, UK leader Keir Starmer also said that he was ready and willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a peace deal if necessary. So for Ukraine, it's acceptable to have British troops on the ground, right?
Britain helps Ukraine a lot, and people of Ukraine are grateful for Britain's assistance. Yes, I think that would be acceptable, in my opinion.
Glenn, with European leaders now working to ensure their involvement in peace talks, do you think Europe is ready to step up and take a more independent role in global diplomacy, particularly when it comes to defense and security? As we already spoke about the possible British troops to be on the ground, to be settled on the ground in Ukraine. Do you think such scenario is possible?
No, well, the European armies aren't big enough to replace the United States. And furthermore, there will be too many divisions, I think, between the Europeans. The Americans can easily play them against each other. But I think in this case, for the United States, they would be okay with it if there is some peacekeeping force, then the US will probably be happy with it. They just said that they want to wash their hands with it and leave. So if the Europeans want to take over and manage this, then I think the US would be quite comfortable with it. But I think given that NATO Article 5 won't apply, which means that if there will be some conflict, then the Americans won't come to the assistance of the Europeans if they end up in a clash with the Russians. So I think a lot of European countries will be hesitant to send their troops. And furthermore, while the Americans might accept it, the Russians will certainly not, because keep in mind, again, the Russians invaded in 2022 because they wanted to prevent NATO from expanding to Ukraine, even official membership or de facto membership. Now, the fact that Russia now wins the war and somehow the peace agreement will include to put troops from NATO countries into Ukraine, it doesn't really make much sense. So it has to be noted that the reason why the Americans are making this, accepting this, is because NATO lost the proxy war. Russia has won the war. They realize that by every day that passes, Ukraine will lose more manpower, lose more territory. So there's not going to be put any demands on Russia. There won't be any demilitarization of Russia. There won't be any NATO troops in Ukraine. This is going to be a peace agreement in which Russia will have to get most of its demands, not because it's necessarily just or fair. And I can imagine on the Ukrainian side, it will be seen as a humiliating peace, but nonetheless, this is what happens when one side wins in a war, and this is where we are. And it's we're very sad that this peace agreement didn't happen 3 years earlier. Keep in mind that in the beginning of 2022, the Russians were happy with pulling back their troops back to where they were before February 2022 in return for Ukraine is restoring its neutrality. But again, we had 3 years of war, and this is the horrible outcome, which we now have to accept because there are now other and no better options.
Well, and do you agree with this statement that Russia won the war and we have to accept the reality at the moment?
I do not agree with this statement, no. I think Russia actually suffers more than they put out, and they're very well known for keeping a poker face and not showing their pain through. That's part of the culture. And I think there is a lot of bluff in statements and in demands. So, yes, I do not agree with that statement. I think if we push a little bit further, we will see a result of Russia failing sooner.
And that's a very important issue, Olena. What's happening today? Donald Trump is in power and he promised to resolve the conflict between Russia and Ukraine within a day, within a month, as he was saying before and during his election campaign. Therefore, today we can see how Donald Trump is trying to reach the consensus as soon as possible. Therefore, how concerned is Ukraine that the US may try to reach a peace agreement with Russia that doesn't fully account for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty?
Look, it is concerning when you're not part of the negotiations because it leaves a lot of place for creating of uncertainty. Donald Trump is a good negotiator. He's a strong negotiator. And I believe he is acting based on the information he has. Question is what kind of information he has. I do not know that. So he probably will try to make a deal based on what he knows. What will come out of it, let us see. But it is very concerning that the country, as I said earlier, has the best knowledge of the enemy, of the other opposite side, is excluded from the negotiations when they can be the most valuable contributor, and they can make this deal much more realistic and much more acceptable, as opposed to not.
Olena, and what do you think about the division amongst the European Union member states? Let's say, speaking about today's Paris summit, Hungarian foreign minister Orja said that participants of this summit seek to prevent peace in Ukraine.
I think they're in transitory state. They're trying to wait and see what would happen, and it's same uncertainty that we had talked about before. I think they are in a stage of collecting information and waiting on further moves to be able to make better decision that will work for them better than what they're seeing now.
Gwen, what's your attitude to the position of the United Kingdom and France, we can see that these two European countries are now trying to concentrate the power around themselves to make sure that Europe is still actively supporting Ukraine. Doesn't matter how the United States is building its future foreign policy within the direct talks with Russia or any other ideas it may have.
Well, I think that this is, given that both Britain and France have been traditionally military powers, I guess if you have a Europe in a military conflict now with Russia, it makes sense to focus on creating a common military, finding military solutions, pretending or at least having the ambitions to be able to fill the shoes of the United States. It's a way of asserting leadership in Europe. Obviously, the British have wanted to do so since Brexit, and France also, which has often been in the shadow of Germany, would like to do the same. But it has to be pointed out that despite all the criticism of what the United States is doing, there's no actual counter-proposals, neither from the Europeans or from Zelensky. Indeed, their main goal is simply to do more of the same, more escalations, more weapons, and keep the war going. And again, keep in mind that what has happened over the past decade, the Europeans gave guarantees for unity government back in 2014 before they backed the coup in Ukraine. They committed themselves to the Minsk agreement for 7 years before admitting that they weren't really intending to implement it. There was only to buy time. When the Ukrainians had an election in 2019, in which 73% voted for a peace platform, the Europeans also assisted in subsidizing or funding NGOs, which forced effectively Zelensky to reverse his peace mandate and instead reject the Minsk agreement. And in 2022, as we also learned, the Russians and Ukrainians were close to a deal. And as to quote Zelensky at that time, he pointed out in March of 2022 that there's many Western European or Western countries who would like to see a long war instead, even if it destroys Ukraine, so they can bleed the Russians. So I think this objective to keep the war going, often at the expense of the Ukrainians, is something that's quite consistent. And this is also why neither the Americans nor the Russians want the Europeans there at the negotiation table, because I think this is what the British and the French have communicated as well. They don't have a proposal for ending the war. They just want to continue it and extend it. And I think this is what the United States don't want anymore. The Russians don't want it. So, the reality is, if Russia and America comes to a deal, I don't think it really matters to what extent the Europeans or even Zelensky will approve of it. I think that it can be imposed upon them, given that the United States is has the main punching power in this conflict that is on the Ukrainian side, and it will impose its will. If the Europeans go against it, I think the Americans are able to play the Europeans against each other sufficiently in order to impose whatever agreements it negotiates with Russia.
And I would like to listen to the opinion of you, Elena, for the same question. As Mr. Dizen says, if United States and Russia come to any kind of agreement, then Europe will not be able to do anything. But still, there is a concern of Ukraine around what's happening now and today. So please, your vision of the situation.
Well, I think that Ukraine definitely needs to be part of the negotiation, and I think that we need a better plan to which Ukraine would agree and that would respect Ukraine's interest as well. And I think once Ukraine's interests are factored in, it will have a higher chance for being accepted.
Well, dear experts, thank you very much for your participation in our today's program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Just to remind, today with us we had from Norway Glenn Diesen, professor at the University of the Southeastern Norway, and from Kiev with us we had Olena Urmey from Dignitas organization. Dear viewers, do stay with A News and see you in the next edition.